All right, we're recording. Cool. So it's 9:01. I'm gonna get started. Okay, some announcements. Lab 9 is due the 4th. 10 is due the 9th. The quiz and the autograder for Lab 10. The autograder is pretty difficult, so give yourself plenty of time to do that. It's the DP one. And then Project 4 is due the 7th. Make sure you finish that up. Ideally, finish that up before the deadline because the exam is, 4 days later. And it's just nice to get that all done ahead of time. For the exam, it is at 8 a.m. However, you can request to take it at 1:30 or at 10 p.m. Eastern time. Any questions on announcements?
Wait, do we have to have an excuse to request that, or do we are we supposed to take it at 8 a.m.?
No, you don't need an excuse. As long as you just request that ahead of time, filling out the form, you're good to go.
Oh, okay, so you do have to request an alternate exam, but you don't have.
Yeah, you don't need an
have a
excuse,
reason for
but
it?
you have to request one. Correct.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, that's nice too because 8 a.m. exams are not fun.
Yeah, that's not good.
Any other questions with announcements?
I think they said that they would just leave them all open and you just take whichever one you want.
Oh, you're actually totally right. There's actually going to be 3 exams offered. Thank you for reminding me. We're switching up the format this time. There's going to be an exam at every single time frame. And then make sure to only take one of them. If you take more than one, you will have an honor council penalty. So just take one of them, whichever one you want, and start it at that time. Thank you for that reminder. And yeah, and then there's also an exit survey that you got to take. And that's about it. Then you'll be done with 281. Good job, guys. Today we're going to talk about Dijkstra's algorithm. I believe you covered it in lecture today. If not, you'll cover it Thursday. And then talk about permutations, algorithm families, and then the notorious DP. Anybody go to lecture today? You do cover Dijkstra's, correct?
Yeah, that was today.
Cool. Okay, so let's talk about the handwritten problem from last week. As a reminder, that was the one when you had the graph and you had to see, well, this was actually 2 weeks ago, but it feels, yeah, it's strange. So the 2 week ago handwritten problem is when you have to find the cycle in the graph, return true if there's a cycle, otherwise return false. There was essentially 2 ways to approach this problem. You could do a depth first search or you could do a breadth first search. Both of the ideas are relatively similar, just you traverse the tree differently. In both situations, you want to declare some sort of a bool vector that says visited, initially set to false, where the indices represent nodes in your tree. And then, if you visit a node and it's represented as already true, that means you've been there before and you would return true for that there is a cycle. You can look at the implementation yourself, but that's essentially what you're doing with the depth first search, as well as the breadth first search. You're just traversing the tree in different ways. There was also a third solution. If you can recall, when you have trees, a connected graph without cycles, there are exactly the number of vertices minus 1 edges. So a little cheat that you could have done is you could have just counted up the edges. And then if you had more edges than the number of vertices subtracted 1, then you would have a cycle. Any questions on the handwritten solution?
Can you explain how this is breadth first search and depth first search?
Yeah, for sure. So typically when you have a DFS, that's when you use a stack, whether that be a data structure or that would be recursion. And you can see that this is a depth first search because in this line right here, you make a recursive call to the same function. So that will iterate through in a depth first search sort of pattern. And if you can recall the way that you do that, so let's imagine that a graph is something like a tree like this. This type of pattern, when you make those recursive calls, would iterate something like this through the nodes, where 1 is the node that you start at. So it kind of it traverses through the children before it traverses through the siblings. And that's how this is a depth first search, while the other one is a breadth first search, and you know it's a breadth first search when you use a queue. And in a queue, you do a type of level order traversal, and you can see that this is a queue here. Declare the queue, then we do a while loop saying while the queue's not empty after pushing a certain node. And then inside that, we just do a for loop where we visit all the siblings. And that's how you can tell that it's a breadth first search. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks.
Mm-hmm. It is worth knowing that for a depth first search and a breadth first search, the complexity of a depth first search in a normal tree would be, or the space complexity. So the runtime complexity of each search will be the same because you're going to visit every node. However, the space complexity of a depth first search is going to be the height of the tree, while the space complexity of a breadth first search is going to be the total nodes in the tree. So a depth first search can sometimes actually be more efficient with space complexity. Okay.
Wait, why then do you have to store, like, why do you have to store every node for a breadth first search? Why don't you, because you go like left to right, I guess.
Yeah, you
So,
don't
like, I'm just trying
store.
to remember why.
Right. So let's imagine we got a tree like this. You're right. You don't store every node. But I guess when I was talking about those complexity, I was talking about worst case complexity. And with the breadth first search, you have to store all the nodes at the given level. So when you get to that bottom level of a balanced tree in a breadth first search, you'll have essentially a queue that's filled with half of the nodes in the entire tree and divided by 2. In this case, we have 4. And O of n divided by 2 equals O of n. And then for a depth first search, when you do a depth first search, your space complexity isn't the entire bottom row of the tree. It's only like one given height of the tree, something like that. And in that case, that would be O of height of tree. So yeah, there are times that a depth first search is actually more efficient space-wise than a breadth first search.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Okay. Let's talk about Dijkstra's algorithm now. So you covered this in lecture today. And essentially what Dijkstra's does is it finds the shortest path from a given vertice to every other vertex in your entire graph. So if we choose A as our given vertex, our Dijkstra's algorithm is going to say it's going to give us the shortest path to get from A to B. It'll give us the shortest path to get from A to E, A to F, A to C, any other vertex in our entire graph. Okay. So actually implementing Dijkstra's is very, very similar to Perms. It's a greedy algorithm. It has to store 3 things like Perms does. You have to have a vector of bools that say whether the vertex is currently in the shortest path, whether you've calculated it yet, just like an MST, or whether you haven't calculated it yet. And then it has a vector for the parent nodes. And then it also has a vector for the distance from S to that given node. So the setup itself is very, very similar to Perms, as well as the complexity. The difference from Perms is when we're in Perms, when we're calculating that distance vector, we're calculating that distance to be the length from that vertex to its parent. In this case, that distance for a given vertex will be the distance between that vertex and whatever arbitrary vertex we chose to find the shortest path from. So let's say that we choose A to be our shortest path. In Dijkstra's, the distance is going to be from, say, node E to A, node D to A, rather than just the distance from that to its parent, if that makes sense. I think it will make more sense when we run through an example. And here's the actual algorithm. Very similar to Perms, we loop through the vertex and we visit the unvisited vertex or vertices rather, find the one that has the shortest distance, set that to true, and then update the distances of the remaining ones that are not currently in the shortest path yet. I hope that when we run through the example, it will be a lot more simple. So let's do that. Okay. So similar to how we implemented Perms in project 4, the first thing we do is we choose an arbitrary vertex to make where we want to gather the information for the shortest distance from all the other vertices to it. So let's choose A to be it. So we're going to set A to have a distance of 0 to itself, kind of trivial. And now we have to go through all the vertices that are not currently in the shortest path and choose the one that has the shortest distance. So since we set A to 0, we'll choose that one first, set it to true, and then its parent will be itself, so we don't really need to fill out that column. Okay, so here we have A, and A is connected to C and B. So its edge between A and B is 6. This is less than infinity, so we can update that to 6. And then we can say that its parent is A. Similarly, we can do that for C. Set that to 4, parent as A. Those are the only 2 vertices that A is connected to, so we have to stop there. So now we repeat, and now we find the next shortest distance to choose to put in our shortest path, and that's going to be C. So we set that to true, and now we repeat with C. So C is touching B. So this is where it gets different than Perms. C is touching B, and it has a distance of 1 between C and B. We also know that C has a distance of 4 between C and A. So if we have B and we go through C rather than just going through A, it would have a distance of 5 to A rather than 6. So we update that to 5, set this to B as its parent, or rather C, and then we continue. And what this is essentially doing is, originally we said B's shortest path to A is 6. Now that we added C to our shortest path, let me get, where's orange? Oh, there we go. Now that we added C to our shortest path, we said, hey, that's not actually, oh, it's because I'm highlighting. That's not actually the shortest path. The shortest path goes through C, like that. And now C is also connected to D, so we can update that to 5. That would go through C. And then it's also connected to F. Oops. So we update that to 7. And that is it for C. Any questions so far before we continue? So it's essentially very, very similar to Perms. The only difference is that distance calculation. Not only do we look at the edge between C and B when we looked at B, but we also added that to C's current distance to A.
Oh wait, just double checking. Where'd you get the 5 on, like, for the 5 distance for vertex B?
Yeah.
Was that just 4 plus 1?
Exactly. So what the distance right here for B says is the shortest distance from B to A. Previously, we calculated that as 6, but now that we added C to our shortest distance, we saw that we can actually go through C and have a shorter distance to A than just going A to B.
Okay, thank you. So it's basically just like you're trying to find the shortest distance to get there, but you can go through other ones as well.
Yep,
It doesn't
and we're
have a
just,
direct
yep.
path.
And essentially we're going through every vertex and we're saying, hey, can we use this vertex to get a shorter distance?
Okay, thank you.
Yep. So like F, for example, this D column at F says the shortest distance from F to A. For E, the shortest distance from E to A. D, shortest distance from D to A. They're all going back to A because that's what we really care about. So that is good for that iteration. Now we have to, so we updated all the distances with C. So now we're going to go to the next one. So it looks like, I believe we actually, Okay, so we have, okay, yeah, I messed up. So D, it's not actually 5. It is 5 plus 4. So when we were at C and we updated D, we'd have to add 5 plus 4, C's distance plus the distance between C and D, to give us 9. Okay. So now we're going to make another iteration, and we're going to choose the shortest distance to A, which is now, that's not currently in the shortest distance. So the only false, so 5 would be that at B. So we set B to true. And then we look at all of the vertices touching B, and we see if we can update them with a shorter distance than it currently is. So here we are with B. So E is 2 away from B. It is currently set to infinity, but now we can set it to 2 plus B's current distance, so 5, gives us 7. And we see that's from the parent is B. Okay, so before we continue, the whole reason that we leave this parent in here is so that we can kind of backtrack back to A and know the path to take. So if we're at E and we say that we know that the shortest path right now goes through B, then we can go to B and we say, okay, how do we get to A from B? The shortest path goes through C, and then C goes to A. So it kind of gives us this way to backtrack our way to A from every single vertex. Okay, so we updated E from B. Can we update F? No, F's not touching. Can we update D? Yes. So B is 5. 5 plus 2 is 7. E is already set to 7. Oh no, it's currently set to 9. We're looking at D. So we can set D to 7 because 2 plus 5. And then we can say that this parent is now B. So we updated all the distances that we could. So now we go to the next one. So we can choose, go on.
Should F's distance be 7 plus 4 because you're coming from C?
For which one? F?
F.
Yeah, you're totally right. So this would be 7 plus 4, which is 11. Yeah, I'm kind of caught in that Perms mentality. Thank you. Okay, so now we go to the next one and we choose between D and E because those are both set to false and they're both 7. So we could actually choose either one and it would work out. However, on the exam, we'll typically tell you how to break ties because it'll affect the path that you take. So let's assume to break ties here, we just take let's take D because it's less than E. So let's just take D. So we're gonna set D to true. And then we're gonna look at D. And C and B are its only edges and they're already both in the shortest path, so we can't actually do anything. So that one was short. Now we go to E. And the reason we chose E is because it's 7 rather than 11. Set that to true. Now we're here. And it looks like E is connected to B. But B is already in the tree. So E to F would be whatever E is plus 3. That would be 10 rather than 11. So we can update that. And then this is parent is E. And that's all we can do there. And then trivially, we can add F. Any questions?
I just have like a clarification question.
Yeah, what's up?
So I mean, I get like the only difference between Dijkstra's and Perms is just like the difference between higher kind of adding the edges.
Yeah.
Is that like so you can just get an ordering for your path? Is that like the main reason for that, or?
Exactly. I mean, Perms finds an MST. So you would use Perms when you want to find the minimum spanning tree. Dijkstra's, on the other hand, is when you want to find the shortest path between every vertex and one specific vertex.
Okay, I just kind of realized that right as I said it. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, yeah, so that's that. And then you can look at the slides for the walkthrough. Okay, let's talk about generating permutations. If you started the project 4, you should be familiar with this in part C. So I never actually had an Android, but these are the passwords and you can look at that like permutations, trying to solve the combinations if you don't know the password. Okay, so we can think of permutations as being part of a tree. For example, if we look at this tree, we can think of the permutations for all possible combinations of 4 colors. The colors here would be blue, yellow, red, green. So each path would be like choosing the color at that location. So starting here and going to here would be like the permutation blue, yellow, red, green. On the other side of the tree would be like green, red, yellow, blue. And the total number of leaves, or I guess total paths if we look at the bottom, leaf nodes would be the 4 colors, would be 24 ways, because it'd be 4 factorial. So if we look at this like a tree, I mean, we could essentially traverse it 2 ways. We could do a depth first search, or we could do a breadth first search. I'm gonna let you guys think about this. These 2 questions right here. What would be the maximum size of the stack if we did a depth first search versus the maximum size of the queue if we did a breadth first search? This kind of brings us back to maybe 15 minutes ago when we were talking about those trees. Feel free to like answer in chat or unmute yourself. You guys want more time or confused or what?
I'm just thinking.
Okay. So let's think how we traverse. So if we did a breadth first search, or let's go depth first search first. If we had depth first search, we would go like this. Then we go here, here, here. Then we go here, here. And this. Just like that. And if we did a breadth first search, we would go like this. And we continue going until we get to the very bottom where we have all of these little guys in there. So like above, for the depth first search, the space will be O height. And for the breadth first search, the space will be O n. But in this case, n is actually like n factorial, because n is the number of colors. And I guess height in this case would just be 4, would be n as well, because n is the number of colors. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Cool. So if you had to implement both of these, it would actually be much preferred to use a depth first search rather than a breadth first search as far as space. And you can imagine if you had, say, 5 or 6 or 7 permutations, 7 factorial is giant compared to O of 7. Okay. So the code for generating permutations Well, it's very similar to both. If you think back in lecture, going back to that juggling, I think it was like lecture 4 or 3, we talked about juggling with a queue and a deck, I believe, or a queue and a vector or something. And then also in project 4, part C, we also kind of do this. And this just gives us a way to generate permutations. So what we would do is we have this right here as kind of a base case check to say, do you have a current solution? And to check the solution, we say if n fixed is equal to the size of the vector, where the vector is the items. So in this case, the vector would be 4. A size of 4 would have every single color. And then int fix would be 4 if we trigger at this base case. So that means we have 4 fixed colors, size of the vector. There's no more permutations to make in this given stack frame. And then if you don't break out of that base case, then you know that you do have permutations left that you can make. So we do a for loop. This keeps track of the number of fixed. And essentially all you're doing is just swapping, then making a recursive call and swapping back. And this is exactly the code essentially from project 4. Yeah. Are you guys confused about this? It's kind of confusing to wrap your head around. We can potentially like run through an example if that helps.
Now this is just the most basic, right? Like this is like looking at every single permutation. This isn't like.
Yeah, so this would essentially get every single permutation in the vector of items.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. I think it just gets confusing when it gets into like having to like go with lower bounds and upper bounds and trying to like
Yeah, with
optimize.
project 4.
Yeah.
We'll actually talk about that in a little bit too, so hopefully we clear that up.
Cool. Thank you.
I guess like for me personally, it's just kind of difficult to wrap my head around the recursion aspect of it and like how the stack frames work. But yeah, from a general idea, like you swap some items and then you say, okay, I'm going to call this function keeping these items permanent, and then whatever is to the right of n fixed, we're going to continue swapping those. Okay, so if we had a list of 1, 2, 3, and 4, that's 4 items. This would list all the possible permutations of those 4 items. And you can count them, but it should be 24. And then if we had, instead of 4 items, if we had 7 items, you'd have much more permutations. So I'll give you guys a second to think about this. How many permutations would start with the 3 letters ACE? Four factorial? Yeah, exactly. So in this case with ACE, you can imagine like fixed to be set to 3. So the first 3 letters are fixed. Then we have the next 4 letters that we're continuously swapping and finding permutations of those. So you would take 7 factorial minus 3 factorial to get, or 7 factorial divided by 3 factorial to get 4 factorial. Exactly. All right. And that's the solution. And then, yep, like I said, you would get the solution if you called gen perms with a vector that had the items in that order with the n fixed to be 3. And also you pass by reference so that you can, just for efficiency as well as modifying the vector. Yeah, and then that is the same exact code that we showed earlier. Any questions on this code, generating permutations? Or anything else that we discussed so far? All right, let's continue. Algorithm families. Okay, so there's essentially six algorithm families that we discussed in this course: brute force, greedy, divide and conquer, backtracking, branch and bound, and dynamic programming. The brute force is just the simple, I guess, straightforward kind of solution you think of initially, typically the most inefficient. And then you have a greedy approach that you can typically take. And if you can take a greedy approach, the idea behind it is you're making locally optimal decisions in the hope that it will produce a globally optimal solution. And you can see this with Perms, for example, or Dijkstra's, where, when we're adding a vertex to our shortest path or our MST, we're making a locally optimal decision. We're saying, okay, we're looking at all the edges that are closest to this one right now. And that ends up producing a globally optimal solution. So when greedy algorithms work, it's great. It's typically an easy implementation and it's fast. Then you have divide and conquer, where you break the problem down into subproblems, solve those, and that produces the problem or the solution. An example of that would be like merge sort. And then backtracking is kind of like generating permutations would be a form of backtracking. It would solve constraint satisfaction problems. And these type of algorithms are typically O of 2 to the n time complexity. And what makes them different from branch and bound, which are very similar, is that branch and bound actually finds an optimization, while backtracking just finds the constraint satisfaction. And branch and bound is also O of 2 to the n, but typically you would use pruning. I guess in both that you can use promising. So you can make this 2 to the n lower constant factor, but they're still relatively slow algorithms. And yeah, so backtracking would be like constraint satisfaction, while branch and bound not only is constraint satisfaction, but it also finds all of the solutions. It finds the optimal solution, whether that be like the minimum, the maximum. And both of these problems are typically exponential runtime. Then recently we talked about dynamic programming, and dynamic programming is like a very powerful approach where you can typically take like an exponential runtime and get it down into a linear runtime, or a polynomial rather. And you can kind of identify dynamic programming problems when you notice that like the problem has a bunch of overlapping subproblems that you can reuse, calculate once, and then just reference those problems. In practice, would backtracking be faster than branch and bound? So, no, actually. So backtracking, if you can recall, it would use, you have two checks. You have one check to see if you have your solution, and then you have a recursive call. Those are the two characteristics of a backtracking problem. Branch and bound is like backtracking, but there's an additional check, and that final check is like the pruning check to see if the solution that you're going towards is promising. Well, I guess you can also implement a promising function for backtracking too. So I guess in the sense that backtracking, you can stop when you have one solution, but branch and bound, you have to continue until you find the solution. It would be faster in that aspect. But I guess, I don't know. Let me ask you guys. I don't think we typically prune with backtracking. I think that's the whole idea of branch and bound, is that we do this is promising function. I don't think we implement that with backtracking. And that is promising function reduces the constant factor of the time complexity significantly. And we'll talk about that with branch and bound. So I would actually say branch and bound. I don't know, it's a trade-off because backtrack, you can stop when you find a solution. But branch and bound, you can't stop when you find just a solution, but you also implement this as promising function that can prune the tree a lot to make it a lot faster. So there's a trade-off there. I don't think you can say like one is necessarily faster than the other. So let's go into, do you guys have any questions on, I guess, the general table of algorithms? Okay, let's talk about branch and bound. And this will help a lot in part C of the project if you haven't finished that yet. Okay, so the three parts of a branch and bound algorithm is you have this promising function, then you have the check for the solution, and then you have the recursive calls. The is promising function says essentially stop if you can't do better than you currently have. Stop if the solution isn't going to be good. And then the is solution is when you already have a solution. So you completed the recursive call for, you're at the top of the stack frame, you're done making recursive calls for this stack frame. You say, if this current solution that you produced is better than the best solution so far, update the best so far. That's what you do in that. And then in this, you would recurse. And then the question is, can we use branch and bound optimization with our gen perms code? What do you guys think? I guess you kind of do use that, don't you? Okay, so, I guess like in this example, okay, yeah, I guess what this is just showing that is if you are able to prune a tree, like right here, it would reduce the number of calculations you're doing significantly. I think that maybe what they're getting at with this right here is saying that, no, you couldn't use the branch and bound optimization because in our code, we want to make every permutation. So if we prune, I mean, we're losing a lot of potential permutations. Okay, yeah, so that would make sense. So yeah, the gen perms function is backtracking. When you do backtracking, you don't prune. That's specifically for branch and bound. Okay, so let's talk about the bounds in branch and bound. So with optimization problems, we can determine when we want to prune by using bounds. And there's two types of bounds. We have lower bounds and we have upper bounds. The upper bound is the best solution that we found so far. So with the upper bound, we know that the final solution that we produce, the optimal solution, is going to be no worse than the upper bound. And then the opposite, with a lower bound, we calculate like an estimate. So let's say that we're like a part way into our current solution. We would calculate an estimate for the best possible solution that we could produce, given our current solution. And we know that the optimal solution is going to be no better than our current solution plus this lower bound. And with this lower bound, since we know that the optimal solution will be no better than this lower bound, if our lower bound plus the current is already greater than our current best, then we know that it's not even worth continuing going down that, and that we can just prune that branch and continue. Any questions on this? It's kind of confusing. So in the project, the lower bound is like when you make that MST and you connect the MST to your current path. And the upper bound is like when you take the opt or not the opt, the fast TSP. Okay. So let's look at an example. So let's say that this is our current path right here. And, you know, we don't know this yet, but here are the possible solutions where the lower they are, the better they are. Yeah, it's kind of a confusing diagram, but, and then here would be like our current upper bound, our best so far. So in this example, we have our current solution. And when we add that to our lower bound, which is our optimistic choice, we would get something like this. Let's say that that's what we get. In this tree, we know that our best solution is going to be no better than this optimistic solution. However, this optimistic solution is significantly better than the best so far. It's better than the best so far. So because the optimistic solution, which is the lower bound plus current, because that's below the best so far, then we know that we should pursue this. We can't prune this tree because it might give us our best, our optimal solution. So that would be one example, which is just shrank down right here. Yep, that's the same example. Okay, so now let's look at the next one. So let's say that we had the situation where our optimistic solution is worse than the best so far. So no matter what happens, if everything works out perfectly, we know that the solution we're going to produce is worse than our current best so far, our current upper bound. In a case like this, we would totally prune because there's no point to continue going down this tree if we already know the solution is going to be worse than our current best solution. And then a third example would be our optimistic solution gives us a solution that is better than the best so far. So we cannot prune it because we might have a final solution that is better than our best so far. However, unknown to us, all the possible ones are actually worse than the best so far. So this one would say, like, we can't prune it because we don't know this, but we're doomed to fail. Yeah, any questions on this?
I'm just wondering, like, why is the MST the lower bound? Like,
Yeah, the
like,
reason.
I guess
Go on.
Sorry, I was wondering if that's always the case. Like, I know, I guess for the project that, like, what we did in part A is the lower bound. Is the MST always the lower bound?
You know, it depends on the problem that you're answering. No, the MST isn't always the lower bound. Your lower bound is an estimate for whatever your solution is. And in the project, using an MST is, since we know the MST is a minimum spanning tree, it's the best way that you could potentially, possibly connect the vertices that aren't currently in your path. And because you have to connect all the vertices, because we're making a cycle, like, we know that our final solution could be no better than our current plus the MST. So in the TSP problem, an MST is a good approximation. It's a good estimate for the lower bound. But, you know, depending on the branch and bound problem, you could use different estimates.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And, you know, that's a good point. So, like, the estimate that you choose for your lower bound, yeah, it can vary. It's not just an MST. Okay, let's talk about over pruning. If you're having a difficult time with the project in that your solution is not coming out to be, is not like the right distance, it's probably because you're over pruning. And what that means is your estimate for your lower bound is either too large or, yeah, so it'd be your lower bound estimate would be too large. No, actually, your lower bound estimate would be too good. It'd be too small, so that you would be pruning solutions that you shouldn't necessarily be pruning. So and this says like if our upper bound is invalid, then you'll never find a solution. If our lower bound is invalid, then you might be pruning potential solutions and your answer will be wrong. So if you're getting the wrong answer, look to your MST estimate and how you're connecting the arms. And then variance that must hold for your upper bound. Your upper bound must be greater or equal to the optimal solution, while your lower bound estimate must be less than, or sorry, it must be worse or equal to the optimal solution. In our case, it must be a longer path or equal to the optimal solution. Okay. So, with bounds, there's a trade-off. If you had a tighter bound, you would potentially be able to prune more trees or more paths. But there's a trade-off because typically to get a tighter bound would take more time. So like, although it would allow for more pruning, it might also take more time to make that estimate, which in the long run, if you're making that estimate significantly, then it could be slower. And like it says here, if the cost of computing our bounds uses more time than saved from pruning, the bounds are useless. You kind of have to experiment to find the most effective bound. And this goes back to our generating and pruning permutations. So in the last code, it was like a backtracking formula. Now here, we have a branch and bound formula, which is the same thing as the backtracking, but now we have this is promising function. And that's what is the difference between backtracking and branch and bound. So just to answer your question, like which one is faster? Like I said, it's kind of difficult because yes, backtracking does not prune, so it's slower in that regard. However, backtracking stops when it finds a given solution. Branch and bound prunes, so it's faster in that regard, but it has to find every solution because you don't know if you found the optimal solution until you found them all. Let's take like, a 30-second break before we talk about dynamic programming. If you have any questions on the previous part, feel free to ask them. Dynamic programming is very difficult, and this is going to be on your final. Most likely, it's going to be a written problem on your final and worth a lot of points. But don't be intimidated. We'll work through it. And we'll talk about tips for how to approach these problems. And yeah, it won't be bad.
The final is not cumulative, right?
The final is not cumulative, but the content itself is pretty cumulative. So we won't be testing you specifically on information from earlier in the semester, but it might show up just because of the nature of the content.
Okay.
For example, like vectors. Like we talk about those earlier on the course, but you'll likely see vectors again on the final. But we won't be testing you for like the specific time complexity of like a vector versus a linked list, because we already did that on the midterm. Oops. Okay, let's talk about dynamic programming. So like we said, dynamic programming can be used to turn exponential runtimes into polynomial runtimes. It's a very powerful technique, and it's difficult to wrap your head around. And it will be showing up on the final, most likely under a written question. The best advice that I can give is just, obviously study the lectures, study the lab examples, and just honestly just try to do as many DP problems as you can before the exam. Because once you start to do similar problems, you can kind of start forming like the recurrence relation and have a good idea of how to approach the problem. Okay, so the problem, the question can be solved using dynamic programming when you kind of see all these overlapping subproblems. And DP takes advantage of this because it just uses some extra memory and remembers the solution to calculating these overlapping subproblems so that you only have to calculate them once. So it's kind of like a trade-off where you're improving time for increasing memory. Okay, so the naive easy DP problem, Fibonacci. The naive problem itself is exponential, 1.6 to the n. We make these two recursive calls here. But you'll see that, when we're calculating, for example, Fibonacci 6, that calculation calculates like Fibonacci 3, 4 times? 3 times? So like you're constantly recalculating the same Fibonacci's. And there's a lot of overlapping subproblems. So we can use DP to remember these solutions to these subproblems so that we only calculate them once. Okay, so how do we do that? We can start with the base cases and then build up an array. Okay, so I guess I should say that DP, you can solve it using a bottom-up approach or top-down approach. Top-down typically uses recursion. Bottom-up would be iterative. Every problem that we give you in this class, you can solve either top-down or bottom-up, whatever one's easier to you. People typically prefer bottom-up. So let's talk about the bottom-up approach to solving Fibonacci using DP. So looking at the base cases, when n is 0 or n is 1, fib equals 0, fib equals 1. And then we can build up an array that starts from these base cases. And the indices in the array are the Fibonacci at that given location. So indice 0 would be fib 0, fib 1, fib 2, 3, 4, 5. And the first thing we can do is we can populate our array with the base cases. So we know that fib 0 is going to be 0. And fib 1 will be 1. And then from here, when we calculate fib, it just takes the previous two values. So fib of 2 would just take fib of 1 plus fib of 0, which we already calculated with the base cases. So this would just be 1. Fib of 3 would take fib of 2 and fib of 1, so it'd be 1 plus 1, 2. And we can continue doing this until we get whatever fib we want. And essentially, all we're doing is just iterating through an array, which gives us an O of n solution. And we can look at this code right here, which is essentially doing exactly what I said. You have a parameter n for the fib that you want to calculate, and then you have to make a vector that is of size n plus 1. Set fib 0 to 0, the array of fib 1 to 1, and then you just iterate bottom up, starting at 2, and you say this is going to be the previous value plus the value 2 away. And at the very end, you just return fib of n. Any questions on this algorithm? So using DP, we turn this from exponential to linear. I mean, like if you had fib of 10, for example, or let's say 20, fib of 20, like 1.6 to the 20, it's huge. And then if you just use the DP, it would just be like O of 20. So it's like significant, very, very significant. But don't let this deceive you. Like, I think that the problems get a lot more difficult than this one. So that was the bottom-up approach. We can also do it top-down. And by top-down, we just check if we've already calculated that value. If so, we use it. Otherwise, we calculate it and store it. So we can look at that here. We have this vector, our memo, called remembered. Then this case right here would just occur once, and that's just resizing the vector to be the size that we want it to be. Notice that we populate it with -1. And the reason we do that is that gives us an indicator of whether we calculated that value yet. So let's say that we call this with fib of 10. We'll say like, is this value calculated yet? And we know it's calculated if it's not -1. If it's not -1, we can just return that value. Otherwise, we calculate that value and then return the result at the very end. It's a bit deceiving because you'll have to like essentially think about the stack frames. So like if you have a stack frame here, like fib of 10 is going to make 2 stack frames. It's going to make a stack frame for fib of 9 and fib of 8. But at the very end, when you're returning the result, once you get back to this final stack frame, that would return the result of fib of 10. Which brings up a good point. So when you do top-down DP, you are using recursion. So you might have to consider the memory that's involved in the stack frames. Here, the stack frames is O of n, which is already O of n, which is the size of the vector. So the space complexity won't be any higher. But there is more constant space complexity when you use top-down as opposed to bottom-up. Just simply due to the nature of stack frames and recursion. Any questions on the top-down approach for Fibonacci? Okay, let's continue. Okay, so that was Fibonacci. Now let's talk about another type of DP problem. And this one's called pipe welding. So let's imagine that you have a series of pipes that you want to weld together. And you can only weld together pipes that are adjacent to each other. And the cost to weld together 2 pipes that are adjacent to each other is the weight of those 2 pipes. And we want to know what the minimum cost is to weld together all of the pipes into 1 pipe. So for example, if we have 3, 5, 2, and 6, what the cost is to weld them all together. I think this is pretty similar to a written problem you had with like sticks. However, this one is slightly different. You can't just sort it. And the reason you can't just sort it is because we are only considering the pipes that are adjacent. With the sticks written problem where you had to connect the sticks, you could connect them in any order. It didn't matter if they were adjacent or not. So for example of this pipes, one possible solution is that you could weld together 3 and 5 right here. First weld that together. That would give you a cost of 5. Then after that, the total weight of that one becomes 8 because it's 3 plus 5. Then we could weld together 8 and 2. And that would be the max of 8 and 2. So that would give us 8 plus 5, because 5 was the previous weld, 13. Then after we have that, this 8 becomes 10 because it's 2 plus 8, were the weights of the 2 that we welded together. And now we have one final weld to do, which is 10 and 6. And the weight of that is going to be the max of 10 and 6. So it's going to be 10 plus 13, because 13 was the previous cost. And that would leave us with 23. Okay, so that's one possible solution. However, is that the best solution? We don't know. How do we find out the best solution? Well, we could try all the possibilities, but if you try all the possibilities, you're going to get exponential runtime. Instead, we can use dynamic programming to do this in n cubed runtime. Any questions with understanding the problem? Okay, cool. So let's talk about how we can solve this. So first, let's think about base cases. One thing that doesn't necessarily seem intuitive initially, but you'll find when you're solving these types of problems is you wanna break it down into base cases. And one of these base cases would be, what if I want to weld together a pipe with itself? well, what would be the cost of this? It would be 0 because it doesn't cost anything to weld together something with itself. And it doesn't really make sense like why we would use that, but we'll see in a second how that helps simplify the DP a lot. So that's essentially the base case, just welding something with itself. And then how do we think about the recurrence? Well, we want to find the location of the last weld. You know, ultimately, we're gonna have one pipe at the end, but right before the end, there's gonna be 2 pipes, and we want to find like where that location is for that last weld. Whether, you know, the 2 pipes are at the 10 and the 6, or it could have been at like we could have already connected 5, 2, and 6, and then that last weld would be at the 3 in the result of that. That's what we want to find. So for each possible location of the last weld, we want to determine the cost of that last weld, assuming that these are the 2 last pipes. And then the cost is given by the cost of the last weld plus the cost of the pipes. So this is a bit confusing. I think that running through an example might help a little bit. Oh, here we go. Okay, so here's our pipe. There's like 3 possible locations for the last weld. And calculating this location would give us a cost of, assuming that, you know, this is the last weld. We know that this would give us a cost of 13, and it would give us a total cost of 25. We can do the same thing for assuming that this is the final weld. It would give us a total cost of 19. Do the same thing for this one would be the final weld, 22. So the optimal solution can look at all these and find that 19 was the final weld. Okay. So how are we actually gonna put these into a memo table? We're gonna need tables for both the cost of welding as well as the weights of the new pipes created. So we're gonna need 2 memos, and both these memos are gonna be 2D vectors. The base case itself is gonna be found along the diagonal. And yeah, this is a lot of words. Let's just run through an example. Okay, so let's imagine that this is our example. We have 3, 5, and 2. And then we have, because we said we have 2 memo tables, both of them are 2D vectors. One of them is costs and one of them is weights. Okay. So now let's imagine that the indices in these vectors, like this, what would be, you know, the intersection between indice at row 0 and column 0 would be like welding together the pipe at index 0. So what would be the cost of melding together 3 with itself? This is like a base case. Cost 0, exactly. So we can put a 0 right here. And now we imagine index 1 with index 1 would be like melding 5 with itself, which would also be 0. And now index 2 with index 2 would be like melding 2 with itself, which is also 0. And the actual weights for these, well, the weight of melding itself is going to be the weight of it. So 2 is its weight. The weight of pipe 5 would be 5, and the weight of pipe 1 would be 3, or pipe at index 0 would be 3. So here's our base cases, right? We have our cost base cases, which are just melding the pipe with itself, and then the weights would just be the weight of that pipe. Is everybody following along so far? And then like I was trying to get at like the indices in our vector kind of refer to the pipe. So like 0, 0 would be like melding 0, 0. And then 0, 1, like row 0 and column 1 would be like melding the pipe at index 0 with the pipe at index 1. but does everybody understand the base cases so far? Does that make sense? Cool. So this is what I'm talking about. Like this problem itself, like hearing this problem, you would have no idea to, at least I wouldn't have any idea. The first time I heard this, be like, oh yeah, I'm going to need two 2D vectors. And I'm going to need one for costs and one for weights. But once you solve a problem like this, you'll find that you can only ask so many things in a dynamic programming problem. And the techniques are typically similar between problems. So that's why I just encourage you to do as many as you possibly can to get to the point that when you get to the exam and you see that DP problem, you can be like, oh, I've done a problem just like this. Recurrence relation will be slightly different, but I know exactly how to set it up. Would you put something like infinity for 0, 2? That's a good question. So 0 and 2. How the heck are we going to meld together the first pipe with the last pipe? And that's actually our solution. With this bottom-up approach, we want to return this. Because once we meld together 0 and 2, that means we have one pipe. We've like officially melted together all the pipes into one. Because we can't do this with this one until we get to the very end. Does that make sense? Like the way that we're looking at this, being able to weld together 0 and 2 would not be possible, is not possible until we have just 2 pipes left. And then once we weld those together, then we get our solution. What about 2 to 0? That's a good question. So yeah, with our DP table, this is pretty much pointless because the information right here tells you exactly the same information as right there. So we only actually care about half of the table. So we're just going to solve it for the top half, top right half. Okay, so now the approach is to work out from the diagonals. We're going to solve the diagonals first, then we're going to solve this top right one at the very end. Okay, so the first one we're going to solve is going to be this box right here. So this box is going to be 0 with 1. So this is like we're welding together 3 and 5. So what's the cost of welding together 3 and 5? Well, it's the cost to get to 3, which is right here, 0. It's the cost to get to 5, which is 0. And then it's the cost of welding those two together, which is going to be the max of the weight of those two, 3 and 5. And that's going to give us a cost of 5, and it's going to give us a weight of this pipe would be 3 plus 5 would be 8. Any questions so far? So our solution right here is like if we had a pipe that connected 3 and 5. Doing this would be a cost of 5, and then doing this would give us a weight of this pipe of 8. Okay, so that was pretty easy. Now we can also do that with this pipe right here. So this one is like if we had 5 and 2, ignoring that previous orange pipe that we just made. Let's imagine 5 and 2. Connecting those two pipes. So connecting 5 and 2 would be the cost of connecting 5, or the cost of 5, which is 0, plus the cost of 2, well, the cost of melding, I should say, cost of melding 5. And we know the cost of melding 5 is 0 because it's just melding 5 with itself. And then the cost of melding 2, which is going to be 0 because there's just melding 2 with itself. And then the cost of melding those two together is going to be the max of 5 and 2, which is going to give us 5. And then the sum of this, or the weight of making this purple pipe, would be 7. Okay, everybody following along so far? Because we just did the easy part. Now this last one's a little bit difficult. Cool. All right, so now we have this last pipe. right here. And this is connecting, you know, the left side with the right side, which we can only do when we solve this problem. And yellow is kind of a bad choice. Let's change that to something better. Let's do pink. Okay, so, you know, thinking about this, there's really two possibilities that we could do now. Imagine that we connect to the orange pipe. Well, now one possible solution would be connecting that orange one with the red one. This one with that one. So that would be one possible solution. Well, let's imagine if instead we actually use the purple one and connected the purple one with the blue one. That would be another possible solution. So this is a dynamic programming problem that involves minimization. So that's kind of a hint that you're probably going to use a min function inside your recurrence relation. Here we have two possible pipes to connect, so we're going to do some sort of min function. And how are we going to do this? So let's write out both possible pipes. Okay, so let's talk about the orange with the red one first. So the cost of getting to that orange one that we previously calculated is 5. So that would be 5 plus what is the cost of getting to the red one? That's 0. And then connecting those two would be the max of the weight of 8, because that's the weight of the orange one, and the weight of the red one, which is 2. So that's one possible pipe. What's the other one, guys? I'll let you answer the other one. This would give us what? 13? 0 plus 5 plus a max of 3 and 7. Exactly. So the other one's going to be 0 because the other pipe is going to be the purple pipe with the blue one. So the cost of getting to the blue one, because we have that base case of the blue one that has a cost of 0, plus the cost of the purple one, which is going to be 5, plus the max of making the purple pipe plus the blue pipe, or the max of the weights of those, which would be 3 and 7, gives us a total of 12. So that's the idea of how we solve this DP problem. 12, and then the weight of that is going to be 8 plus 7, which is 15. Or rather, 8 plus 2 or 7 plus 3. No matter which direction you go, it's going to be the same. We'll give you 10. So that's the direction you take. How do we actually implement this in code is a difficult part. When I think about this, just writing it out, I did it in like a bottom-up approach, and that's how my mind would work. Some people might see this better as a top-down approach. But the idea is you want to like fill, well, what do you use with your recurrence relation? So when we're at this box right here, our recurrence relation involved taking the cost right here plus the cost right here, or rather, here, let's see if I can do this better. So, you know, calculating this pipe right here, which was one of the two pipes in this final column, involved 13, so it was 8 and 2. So it involved this and this, right? And then the other pipe involved the calculations for this one and this one. So it seems like the top right column, in order to calculate that, we already have to calculate everything to its left and everything below it. So like when we iterate through this, it doesn't really seem intuitive, but like the way that we make these calculations, It's almost like we want to calculate the diagonals first, and then after calculating the diagonals, we want to work like left to right, bottom to top. Because we know when we get to this point, we're going to need all of those calculations below and to its left. Does that make sense? So like Fibonacci involved a 1D memo, and the recurrence relation just involved taking the value right behind it and the value 2 behind it. So you can just iterate left to right. But once you get these 2D memos, sometimes you kind of have to think outside the box. And in this situation, you kind of have to do like a left to right, bottom to up iteration. And you know, the complexity of this problem increases significantly as you get a larger memo. So let's imagine that, you know, instead of this, we had like a 4. Keep on choosing yellow. Let's imagine that we had like a table with like 4 rows and columns. We know that these are all going to be 0 for the cost. And then there's going to be like 1 possible way to get here. There's going to be 2 possible ways to get here. But when we're calculating that final pipe right there, there's 3 possible ways to get there. So when there was 2, we calculated like this one with this one and this one with this one. But when we have 3, we're going to be calculating like this one with that one, this one with that one, and this one with that one. So it seems like when you have a cell, you're using all of the, I guess, cells to the left of it and all the cells to the bottom of it when we're making the calculation for the given cell. Does that make sense? So it's like right here, we're using 3 cells to the left of it and 3 cells below it. So we're actually doing like a linear traversal for each given cell. So the complexity of this problem that we're going to have to form is going to be n cubed. And the reason it's going to be n cubed is because we're filling up this 2D vector, which is obviously going to be n squared to fill up. But then for each cell, we're doing up to n more comparisons. Because for each cell, we're comparing it, we're making a comparison for everything to its left and everything below it, up until we get to the diagonal. Any questions before we go into the actual code? Do you see how you can kind of form this problem into a DP problem? And do you see like the relation for how the pipes line up and like welding them together?
So for your matrix,
Yeah.
like, so basically, is it just like because you're doing, like, you compare them all to themselves? So that's, well, I'm a little bit confused about the 0, 1, 2, 3.
Okay, yeah. What I was saying here essentially is that 0, 1, 2, 3 refers to like the possible comparisons you have to make. So for the diagonal, like you don't do any comparisons. You know that those are all going to be zeros, as we did here. And then when we were filling in this box, which was right above a diagonal or right to the right of a diagonal, there's only one calculation we had to make, right? All we had to do was look below it, look to the left of it, and take the max weights of those 2. So there's one comparison for this diagonal as well as this diagonal. So right next to the diagonals, like to the above or to the right of it, it just takes one comparison. But then it was kind of more tricky when we got here, because when we got to here, it was, you know, it wasn't touching a diagonal anymore. So there's actually 2 pipes that could be formed to make it. And the reason there were 2 pipes was because we had to make a comparison with this one to this one and this one to this one. So what I'm saying is, as we increase the complexity of the number of pipes that are in our 2D memo, the comparisons increase as well. So like in this 4D memo, or sorry, this N of 4 2D memo, we actually have to make 3 comparisons in that final step. We would compare this one to this one, this one to this one, and that one to that one. So that's what I was getting at with like the 3 there. Because you make.
Okay, I see what you mean. Thank you.
Yeah. So like, I just want to say that like, what I was trying to say here is like, you know, your final comparison won't just be 2 pipes. It's going to increase linearly as you increase the size of the number of pipes you have, or the number of pipes you have. Okay, so what's the trickiest thing now? I mean, like, we know how to iterate through this 2D memo, or how we're going to iterate through it. The base case is easy. You know, like when we get to a diagonal, we just set that to 0. Figuring out like right above or to the right of a diagonal, that's kind of relatively simple. We just look at that diagonal and then we take the max. Like, for example, when we're calculating this one, we just literally just take the max of those two weights to the bottom and to the left of it. But it gets confusing when you get further away, because it's like, you know, right here, oops, in like a 3D one, in a N of 3, we're going to make 2 comparisons. In this one, we're going to make 3 comparisons. So we're going to have to like think of a way that we can iterate and compare like this value to this one, this value to this one, and this value to this one. So how are we going to do that? That's confusing. And that's what we're going to see next. You can look through the slides for everything I just said so far. It runs through it. Okay, so this is like a tremendous amount of code. It's very intimidating. Stick with me here. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to have, this is the bottom-up approach, so we're not going to use recursion. And we're going to declare 2 2D vectors for our memos, our memo of weights and our memo of costs, which we do right here. And the size of these 2D vectors, the size is going to be the pipe dot size, which is our input parameter for the vector of ints that refer to the pipes. Okay, so that's that. We declared our 2 2D vectors. And they are initially set to 0. Actually, I don't think we can assume that. No, we can't assume that. So now that we declared those, we have to fill those up. So we have to iterate through these 2D matrices rather. And we can't iterate necessarily left to right, top to bottom, because remember, like, we need to have, when we're calculating a given cell, we need to have all the information below it and to its left already calculated. So if you look at this double for loop here, we're actually iterating from column is our outer for loop, so column set to 0. And then in the nested for loop, we're setting row to column. And we're iterating row backwards. So column 0 and then row to column. So how would that actually iterate? So column 0 would start here, and row would equal to column, so we'd start here. So we do that one first, and then we get to column 1, and we'd say row equals to column, so we'd calculate this one, and then this one. And then for this one, we would calculate this one, then this one, then this one. So that would work for like having the previous to the left and below us before we can calculate the current one. So that's why you have like this little kind of confusing way that you're iterating through these 2D memos. Does that make sense so far? Is everyone following along up until this line? And like, this is, like I said, this is the stuff that's not intuitive, but you just have to do these types of problems to begin to understand it and then apply it to other types of problems. Any questions so far up until that purple line? Okay. So now that we figured out how we're going to iterate through these 2D matrices, let's just deal with the base case. And we know that we're at a diagonal when the row equals the column, which is right here. And this is our base case. In our base case, all we're doing is just setting the cost at that diagonal to be 0. And we're setting the weights at that diagonal to be the sum of the weights. Weights row column equals pipes row. Yeah, we're setting the weights at that column to be the pipe at that location. So exactly what we did in the very beginning. We're setting these to be 0 for the costs. And then we're setting the weights to be 3, 5, and 2 for the weight of the pipe. And that's the base case. Okay, so now that we covered the base case, we know that we're going to have to do our recurrence relation because we're no longer given a base case. And the way that you do that is, as I was getting at, we're going to have to do like another iteration. So like when we were calculating this one, we had to do like two comparisons. We had to find the min of comparing this one with this one, and the min of comparing this one and this one. And whichever one was less, that's the one we took for our total cost for this given cell. So the way that we iterate like that is this for loop right here. We initially set our min total cost to be infinity. And then we do a linear iteration where we set I equal to rho. And then we continue while I is less than column. And then here's our cost for this specific one. What we do is we take the cost of rho I and the cost of I plus 1 column. These are the cost of making those two previous pipes that we're considering to put together. And then we also take the max of the weight of those two pipes. And then right here, we just update min cost to be the min. So essentially what this line is doing here is exactly what we did by hand. And then this is just updating min cost to be the minimum cost of these iterations. So this is pretty confusing. I would really recommend that you go through and try to understand this for loop, like why you start out row and why you go until column. But you'll find that when it all adds up and it all like comes out to be perfect for how we want to compare them. Like this for loop will literally take this value and this value and then this value and this value, and then it'll stop because this is, I guess we can go through it. So we initially set I equal to rho. So if we're right here, rho equals 0. And then we continue while I is less than column. Right here, column equals 1 or 2. So the first thing we do is we take cost at rho I, rho and then I. So rho is 0, I is 0. So we take the cost here. And then we say we add that to the cost at I plus 1 column. I plus 1 is 1 and column is 2. So we add that to the cost here. And then we take the max of those two weights. And then, you know, when I is 2, we would take this one and this one. So that's how you make that iteration to compare those pipes. And then once you do that, after that for loop is ran, then we know what the best pipe combination is for that given cell. And what can we do? Well, we set that cost at that cell to be that min cost that we calculated. Also, we also have to calculate the weight at that cell too. And it doesn't, there's no like, you know, difficult way to calculate that. All you have to do is just take the weights at rho, and then rho plus 1 column. At the very end, we're going to return the cell at the very top right, which is just going to be right here. Any questions with this approach? How are you guys feeling? I know it's hard, but do you feel like you have an understanding of what it's doing?
I'm a little confused about how the weight was put into the matrix still.
How the weight was put into the matrix?
Like after the inner for loop.
Okay, so you're talking about like right here?
No, at the, like
Okay.
also where they do cost too.
Okay, so this one right here.
Yeah.
Okay, well, if we're here, then we already know that we're not in the base case, correct? So we know that we're not on a diagonal. And if we know that we're not on a diagonal, we already filled the diagonal weights to be the pipe at that row. So from there, we already populated that diagonals. And at that point, you can just consider the weights, because like if this is a diagonal, which it will be initially, we've already populated that with the pipe at that location. I guess what are you confused about?
Like the comment says you can arbitrarily choose these two
Oh, yeah.
cells. Yeah.
Yeah, so the reason it's arbitrary, because I mean, we have 3 pipes right here, right? And the calculation for the weight is the sum of the 2 pipes that we're connecting. So regardless of how we connect these 3 pipes, the weight is always going to be 3 plus 5 plus 2. So it doesn't really matter which pipes you choose. You know how you're making multiple comparisons for the total cost? That matters. But once you make all those comparisons for the total cost, actually picking the 2 pipes to connect, it's more arbitrary.
Okay, yeah, that makes more sense.
Does that make sense? Cool. And then, yeah, so you just populate that in the base case too, is how you populate the weights. Any other questions? So this is the bottom-up approach. Honestly, I think that, at least the way my brain works, I think that this is a lot more simple than the top-down approach. But the top-down approach is saying, like, we know that we want to calculate this one. We want this one. Do we have the pipes necessary to make this one? If not, then we have to calculate those values for the pipes to get here. So if there's no more questions on the bottom up, we can look at the top down for a second. All right. So top down. So top down uses recursion. So we're going to have a helper function, and we're going to also, here's our helper function. We're going to declare our vectors for our memos and our main function right here. At the very end, we're going to return, that is return helper. Oh yeah, okay. So at the very end, we're just going to return whatever helper returns, because it returns an int, and that will return our final solution. And then in the helper function, we're going to have our base cases here. If beginning equals ends, beginning equals end when we're at a diagonal, because beginning and end are just going to be 2 integers that refer to the indexes in our 2D memo. So this is the base case diag. And then, we have our for loop here, which is pretty similar to what we did in the other solution. Update costs and weights in return, begin and end. But that's the idea of the top-down one too. As far as complexities, the runtime of these two, it's going to be populating the 2D at memo, which is going to be n squared. But for every entry, worst case, you have to do n comparisons. So it's going to be n cubed. And then the memory is 2 2D memos. So it's going to be n squared. 2n squared comes out to be O of n squared. Yeah. So that is this DP example. A little bit more difficult than Fibonacci. However, when you conquer these DP problems, there's only a few things that can be really asked. Like, they all kind of come down to similar questions. I mean, either you're counting the number of ways, you're finding like a min-max path, you're merging, which is like what we did here with the pipes. Pipe welding. You're making a decision problem, which is the knapsack, which is going to be the written problem. Or you're doing some DP with like a string or a list, like longest increasing subsequence or edit distance. Counting ways, knight moves, we did that in lecture. You're just counting like the possible spaces that the knights could be at. And then the finding the min-max. Coin change is a good one. Climbing stairs is a good one. Yeah, so these are like the 5 common types of DP problems that could be asked. I honestly recommend that you go through every one of those examples and do them. And Yeah, so just some tips on how to approach these DP problems. Like I was saying, you just want to do as many as you possibly can. If you have a LeetCode account, I just highly recommend going in LeetCode and just doing DP problems. On the previous exams, take those DP problems. Really make sure you understand pipe welding and Fibonacci. And in the case that you don't understand what to do in the DP problem when it comes to the exam, there's a lot of partial credit that you can work towards. I'd recommend thinking about the memo. You know, even if you don't know the recurrence relation for the DP problem, just declare the memo. That'll give you a few points. Base cases, that'll give you more points. So like if you don't even do the recurrence, but you have this memo with base cases and you try to do some type of iterating through it, like you're gonna get partial credit, a substantial amount of partial credit. Another thing that can help figure out like the memo is you can look at the time and the space complexity and kind of use that as a hint. For example, in this problem, it was n cubed. There's no way that I could really think about how to use like a 3D memo. So if I, in my head, know that I have to use a 2D memo in my solutions n cubed, I'm probably going to be making like n comparisons within each memo cell. And then the memory is n squared. So then definitely we know that we're not using a 3D memo. So you can also use like the time and the space complexity to help you out, to try to like give you an idea how to approach the problem. But honestly, I'll say like the recurrence relation is the most difficult part of these DP problems. And to really start to understand the recurrence relation, you just have to do a bunch of them. So let's talk about the handwritten now. The handwritten is the knapsack problem, which you go over in lecture. You got this vector of values, a vector of weights that refer to the weight of those values. Or sorry, you have a vector of items, a vector of values, which refer to the value of those items, and a vector of weights, which refer to the weight of those items. You're given a max weight that you can hold, and you want to optimize the items that you have to have the largest value within that weight threshold. And that's lab. You guys have any questions? On the lab 10 assignment, I highly recommend you try to conquer the problem yourself. But if you do run into issues, there's like a little cheat code that you can put in and I'll give you the solution, the recurrence relation and everything. But honestly, like if you have the time, really just try to figure out these problems on your own. Once you start getting the hang of like figuring out these recurrence relations, it becomes a lot easier. And on the exam, you're going to be given a DP problem and it's going to be probably pretty difficult. And you're not going to have this little cheat code on the exam. We could talk about the handwritten solution, but honestly, I want you guys to try to figure it out yourself. If you have any questions or need any help on how to approach it, I'm more than happy to help. But that's it. You guys made it through 281. Good luck studying for finals and thanks for coming.
Thank you.